Growing up, my parents constantly stressed the value of education. I'm the child of Peruvian immigrants, and I think for most second-generation children, there's always an objective to live the life your parents wish they could have had. Now, considering where my parents grew up, they were both quite privileged, and they knew this, so they also made sure to stress how much privilege I have, especially compared to other girls from Peru. But what they also stressed is that being from Peru is a privilege in itself. It allows me to have different perspectives and experiences than my peers. My father always told me I have all of the tools I need to be successful. I have the advantages of a privileged American girl, but the perspective of a disadvantaged Peruvian girl. The rest is really just up to how I choose to use these tools. Because of this, I've always tried to keep in mind how valuable my education really is. Even walking into my school library amazes me, just seeing how much knowledge we have access to in a single building. I'm a firm believer in the idea that knowledge is power, so I truly think if you were able to retain all of this information, you'd be unstoppable. What's even more amazing is that now you don't even have to visit a library. You can literally pull out your smartphone and Google anything you're curious about. But it almost seems like we've become desensitized to this. When you ask most American teenagers about their general views on education, more often than not, they criticize it. But I don't think it's learning they hate. I think what has happened is they've developed a disdain towards the education system, and by extension, learning too. Most teenagers don't study out of passion anymore. They study because it's been ingrained into our minds that it's the only way to live a successful life. When I was living in Peru, I visited an orphanage of sorts. Parents from rural areas who were struggling economically would leave their kids there in the hopes they would get a chance at a better life. The kids were tutored, fed, and taken care of. The day I visited, I met a little girl who must have been about 8 years old and was fairly new to the orphanage. So I was asking her about how she's adapting, and I asked her what her favorite part about being there was. I expected her to say something like the candy they were given every Friday, or the clown who would visit on holidays, or all of the toys she could play with. But instead, she told me her favorite part was the tutoring sessions. She said she couldn't wait for the day that she could read like her brothers. Now, as someone who loves to read, this really warmed my heart. So I told her that I liked to read, and she started asking me all kinds of questions about what books I had read, how many books I had read, how many books I owned, things like that. I wasn't sure how to tell her that I'd never really kept count. I had a shelf full of them in my bedroom, most of which were read, but some of which I hadn't even touched. It had never occurred to me to count them because when I wanted a new one, my parents would buy it for me, and it was as simple as that. I'd never realized that the life I had was the life a little girl who lived so close to me was dreaming of. She comes to mind a lot when I want to complain about how busy my school schedule is or how much homework that I have to do. The fact that there are thousands of girls all around the world who would do anything to be in the place where I am and who see simply having the ability to read and to go to school every day as a privilege really helps me put things into perspective. Currently, there are an estimated 130 million girls out of school globally. Now, to give you a bit of context, that's more than the entire population of Japan. But 130 million girls is only an approximation, and as many developing nations don't actually provide this data, we can safely assume that this number is higher. While it's true that many organizations are working to fight this issue, and that it isn't a severe problem anymore, we haven't progressed as much as you might think. Although education has increased, we are still far from reaching gender parity within education. The ratio of educated boys to educated girls has not shifted. Still, 2/3 of the illiterate population is female. I firmly believe that in every nation, there are thousands of brilliant girls who are potential prodigies. Girls who have outstanding work ethic, who could cure cancer, stop wars, or solve global issues, but rather than thriving and being given the tools they need to use their inherent skills and affect this change, they sit in war zones, in impoverished towns, or in oppressive nations in which they do not have basic access to education. Some of these prodigies are married off as children in order to provide for their families. Others aren't prioritized over their brothers who are sent to school, while they sit at home learning to cook and to clean, being trained as housewives while they watch their brothers learn math and spelling. These girls have not been conditioned by society to hate learning, and instead see it as something of great value. When we give women who've been denied an education the opportunity to study, they are more likely to value it, and thus they will work harder. As I said before, my parents always stressed that being from Peru and having different perspectives is a privilege, and because of this, I think there's a high value in diversity of thought. How can we change the world if only a certain portion of the population is being given the tools and the platform to do so? Historically, impoverished women have been the most silent sex in class. If we finally allow them to speak out, they can use their unheard backgrounds and provide new approaches to solving global issues. Now, even if this educated girl isn't going to cure cancer, giving her access to education can still have a positive effect on her life. Women in developing countries who are educated are less likely to fall victim to child marriage, which leads to smaller families, less likely to develop AIDS, and less likely to die while giving birth. They are also less vulnerable to trafficking, domestic abuse, and sexual abuse as they have a greater awareness of their rights. Lack of education also affects women politically. Looking to Peru as an example, female politicians typically come from wealthier families, leaving impoverished women underrepresented. In order to ensure that a variety of views are being accounted for, we must ensure that these women have the means of representing themselves. Dropout rates for girls in developing countries are also much lower than those of boys, meaning that they will persist on, even if they must repeat a grade. Additionally, statistics also show that women in developing countries who are educated are more likely to put their daughters into school. Now, this all sounds great, but how can we actually make gender equality in education possible? As complex and as difficult as it seems, if we take a more systematic approach and address specific barriers, it becomes much more feasible. One specific change that must be made is tightening child marriage laws. Currently, child marriage is legal in 117 nations. Over 60% of the world's uneducated women were married under the age of 18. Peru is one of the few nations in which child marriage, even with parental permission, is completely illegal. However, this wasn't always the case. Prior to 1999, the law stated that you must be over 14 years of age to get married. Around that time, the rate of girls who continued on to secondary school was at 81%. However, when this law changed and the age increased to 16, the rate of girls continuing on to secondary school also increased to 92%. If all nations adopted these laws, imagine how many more girls would get the opportunity to be educated. Next, we must address the physical act of getting girls to school. On the road to school, girls are at a threat to sexual abuse, violence, and trafficking. Many students, both boys and girls, have to take long walks to get to school and are too tired to learn once they arrive. However, this problem is not unsolvable. Of course, the ideal solution would be for governments in developing countries to prioritize opening schools in forgotten villages, making the walk both easier and faster. However, this is obviously quite difficult. A simpler solution is to provide boarding houses or lodging for students in developing countries. Amantani, a charity based in Peru, which works to provide these lodging houses to young students, reported that in 2016, students who stayed in the boarding houses saved an average of 604 hours, which otherwise would have been spent walking. Next, we must focus on making reforms within schools. Believe it or not, lack of separate latrines is actually a huge obstacle which is stopping many girls from being educated. Rather than face this lack of privacy, many girls do not eat breakfast before attending school, causing them to be unable to focus on their studies. When girls are menstruating, many simply do not attend school at all. This means they will lose over 20% of school days per year. In order to ensure that girls feel comfortable, safe, and are able to focus at school, we must ensure that they are provided with clean and separated washrooms. Recruiting and hiring more female teachers will also help minimize the boundaries girls face when at school. Studies in developing countries have found that due to cultural biases, male teachers are more likely to deprioritize girls' learning and don't pay attention to their needs because they view them as less important. But female teachers are more likely to put priority on girls' learning. they can also serve as a role model for these young girls. They will allow them to recognize that they are capable of so much more than their society is telling them. Jane Austen once said, "Give a girl an education and introduce her properly into the world, and 10 to 1, but she has the means of settling well without further expense to anybody." I would go even further than this. Give a girl an education and she can change her society, and possibly even the world. I have faith that these girls will take advantage of the opportunities offered to them, and that they will persevere. And there are statistics to prove it. Thank you.